Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for sexualities and social issues. So today we're going to do a brief historical overview of how lots of different societies have thought about sex. So the goal for today is not necessarily to give us like a deep, factual understanding of exactly what all of these societies did. It's more to sort of glance at how a lot of different people throughout time and all over the world have dealt with what seems like the same issue. So we're going to take a brief look at a lot of different cultures from different places around the globe and different points in history, and then we'll circle back to America, and we'll talk about what we think about sexuality today and what sort of historical events may have influenced that. So we're going to look at a lot of different things today, so let's get started. So to start, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning and talk about prehistoric humans. So one of the first things that really changed the way that we think about sex and have sex is the fact that we started standing upright. So now when we're walking on two legs, we can have sex facing each other instead of from behind like all the other animals, and that really changed the way that we thought about sex and sex partners. It sort of allowed us to go from mating to making love. So it wasn't a fast transition, but it was something that happened as humans evolved and started to hold themselves differently. The next thing that happened was that we invented art. And the thing about humans is that every time we invent a new art form, we immediately use it for pornography. Every time. So for instance, we invented carving, and here we have a beautiful, probably about 30,000-year-old carving of a vulva. Then we invented painting in caves, and here we have some paintings that are probably maybe 20,000 years old, and you can see an erect penis. Then we invented painting with oils, porn, photography, porn, the internet, porn. Actually, the internet was hugely influenced by pornography because one of the early goals of the internet was to figure out how to send really large files. Can you guess what was in those files? You can. So basically, the human interest in sex has existed the whole time. It's just that different civilizations tend to think about it a little bit differently. So now we're going to talk about how several different cultures thought about sex and sexuality. And I want to be clear that we are going to spend more time on some cultures than others, and it's not because I value them more than others, it's because some cultures left records. Some cultures had written languages that have survived until modern times, some of them had art forms that have managed to survive until modern times, and some cultures just didn't. So it doesn't mean that they weren't interesting or valuable, it just means that I can't show you precisely what they were doing because we don't know. So, let's start with ancient Egypt. We have a lot of good data from ancient Egypt, in part because the climate is so dry and they buried so much art underground. So we're able to see stuff that they put on the walls thousands and thousands of years ago. So, the ancient Egyptians were kind of permissive when it came to sex. Women had a little bit more value in that culture than they do in some other cultures that we'll talk about. So marriage, heterosexual marriage, was actually pretty common, but women could initiate divorce, which is something that we're not going to see in some other cultures for several hundred years. Egyptian culture was also kind of okay with homosexuality, although it is in question. These two men that you see here are famous for being royal servants, but they're always painted together. So there is some question of whether they were also lovers and whether that was accepted at the highest levels of Egyptian culture. Egyptians also had like really early forms of birth control that was made largely of crocodile poop and honey, which is fascinating, and maybe we don't want to try that. But at least it shows that they understood that semen was connected to pregnancy and that women might be able to do something to prevent it, which is, again, way ahead of its time. The Egyptians were also really into 2D art. So they painted and painted and painted and painted. And so we have a lot of depictions of how they might have had sex. You'll see that this is one of them. We had a lot of stories about who had sex with who, which is super interesting. So we know that the ancient Egyptians were pretty sexually evolved and that they understood paternity, which is pretty cool. Next, we'll talk about the ancient Greeks and Romans. We talk about them together a lot because their cultures so directly influenced one another. So, first, of course, the ancient Greeks. So the ancient Greeks are pretty famous in regard to their views on sexuality because they were basically okay with male homosexuality. There was definitely the practice of older men sort of initiating younger boys both into society and sexual behavior, and they were also generally kind of cool with it in regard to like military behavior. So the ancient Greeks made a lot of art, and a lot of it survives still, again, largely due to their dry climate. So we have a lot of really beautiful pottery and wall paintings that depict the way that they thought about sexuality. So women were not particularly empowered in ancient Greece. Men definitely were, and they had a lot of freedom to explore sexually, but women didn't necessarily. So for women in ancient Greece, it was pretty much a homebound situation, but the men were a little bit more prone to exploring, shall we say. They also were really into the male form. A lot of the cultures that we're going to talk about today eroticize the female form, but in ancient Greece they were prone to eroticizing the male form. So they have a lot of really beautiful nude statues and nude paintings and that sort of thing, but the focus does tend to be on men. The ancient Romans were also pretty open sexually. This is one of their coins that was like out in public circulation that clearly shows people having sex, so that's kind of interesting. But the Romans were a little bit more concerned with like wealth and lineage than they were with sex itself. So marriage was really common, but marriage was like a business deal. So passionate love was not necessarily so much of a concern. You might feel passionate love for someone, but you were in no way expected to feel passionate love for your own spouse. So people had sex within their marriages so that they could have babies and pass the wealth along, but it wasn't expected that you would enjoy the sex or that you would actually particularly even want that. So ancient Romans were not quite as permissive as ancient Greeks in that regard. Most of the time, they just sort of had sex with people on the down low if they wanted to feel the passionate part of it. But again, we have a lot of statues and art from them that suggest that sex was not necessarily out of the question. Next, we'll shift our focus to the east and talk a little bit about ancient Indian cultures. So you've probably heard of the Kama Sutra, and you might actually own a copy, but it's in fact really, really old, which is kind of cool. Like there's, in a lot of ways, nothing new under the sun, and the Kama Sutra shows us that. So in ancient Indian culture, it was pretty common to want to enjoy sex within marriage, and this is a theme that we're going to see coming up over and over again. So marriages were kind of a responsibility. It was like a family affair. Your family picked out who you should marry, and then they were pretty active in your marriage ever after, because you all lived together. So you were kind of obligated to have sex within your marriage, but this is one of the first cultures where you were also allowed to enjoy it. So there was a lot of focus on pleasing the woman, there was a lot of focus on pleasing partners both at the same time. So it was sort of experimental, but again, I want to be clear that the focus was still supposed to be sex within the marriage. It's just that it was allowed to be fun. Next, let's look at ancient Chinese cultures. So this one gets kind of interesting, because in ancient Chinese cultures, female orgasm was understood to have a lot of power. So it was actually pretty common for ancient Chinese soldiers, for the men, to have sex the night before they went into battle, because it was believed that if they had sex with a woman and she had an orgasm, they essentially absorbed that energy, they absorbed that power. Men and women were understood to be sort of part of the same whole, the yin and yang, which is probably a symbol that you've seen. And it was thought that you could absorb a little bit of your partner's power when they had an orgasm and then take that with you the next day, which is super interesting. So marriage was pretty common. Most of the time it was a monogamous marriage, but emperors were allowed to partake in concubines. Polygamy is something that we're going to start to see a lot of as we go forward in history. But polygamy basically means that one man has multiple wives. Most of the time we see it among men who are really wealthy or really powerful, because it's expensive to keep up a bunch of wives and all the children that tend to happen. So ancient emperors in China were allowed to participate in polygamy, and they typically had one first wife who was the most powerful, and then a series more wives, as many as they felt like they needed, but those wives tended to decrease in social power. So your youngest wife would sort of be the least socially important, which led to a lot of infighting, as I'm sure you can imagine. But in ancient China, women didn't have a whole lot of power. The orgasm itself was seen to have power, but they didn't have a lot of social power. So to be the concubine of the emperor would actually be a pretty good gig. Next, we'll talk a little bit about Islamic cultures. So as with a lot of the other cultures that we've talked about today, there is a lot of variation, especially because a lot of these cultures have been existing in much the same form for millennia. So within Islamic cultures, a lot of what we see is still true today. So for instance, modesty is really important. But modesty is not important because the people are thought to be ugly. It's actually the opposite. Modesty is considered important because the people are thought to be so beautiful. The women cover their hair because their hair is seen as extra, extra beautiful. And they cover their bodies because they're afraid that their beauty will be seen by men and not by God. So it's not that it's bad to have a beautiful body or lustrous hair. It's just that you're meant to keep it modest to show your devotion to God and your devotion to your marriage. So in Islamic culture, again, marriage is very, very important. Sex within marriage, totally allowable. It's okay to enjoy it. But this is one of the cultures where we start to see the social value of women held down pretty carefully. Women are very often homebound in Islamic culture, and so sexuality takes on a really sort of secretive vibe in that regard. Homosexuality is forbidden. And this continues to be the case. We don't typically see a lot of welcomed and opened homosexuality in Islamic cultures. So marriage here is super important, but again, you're allowed to enjoy sex within marriage, but everything else is pretty much kept on the down low. Next, we'll shift our focus back to the West and start to talk about some Central and South American cultures. So one of the best and first examples that everyone thinks of are the Mayans. They had an extremely complex culture and a lot of really, really beautiful architecture, but we didn't get to keep a lot of their records. So we don't know as much about this culture as we would like to. But we do know that they were pretty focused on warfare. And one of the things that we often see in cultures that are focused on warfare is a sort of temporary situational acceptance of male homosexuality. So typically when we see a lot of men trapped together alone, on submarines, at war, that sort of thing, jail, we tend to see a sort of acceptance of homosexual behavior. Whether or not those people consider themselves to be gay is a separate question and one we'll talk about. But basically, because they were a war-going people, they had a lot of homosexuality in the troops, which is not necessarily unusual. They also had a lot of rituals. And within Mayan culture and Aztec culture, which we'll talk about in a second, it was actually pretty common for humans to sort of stand in for gods and have sex as part of their rituals, as part of their religious beliefs. So we do start to see this happening in Mayan culture. Let's switch, while we're thinking about it, to Aztec Empire. So again, this was a really long period of history, and it combined a lot of different kinds of groups and cultures and tribes. But as a brief overview, they also were pretty focused on using sex as part of rituals. So very often in Aztec culture, you would see a human sort of stand in, like as an avatar for a god, and they would get to have sex, and then sometimes they would be murdered as part of the ritual. There was one ritual where a man got to marry as many women as he wanted in a week, but at the end of the week he was killed. So sometimes it was good, sometimes it was bad. There was also a lot of focus on sacrificing virgins and that sort of thing. So yes, sex was part of the rituals, but not always in the way that you would want. They were also pretty openly accepting of prostitution. So this goddess that you see here at the top was the goddess of female sexuality and prostitutes. This god that you see here depicted at the bottom was the god of male prostitutes and male homosexuality, which again is super interesting. So they allowed for a lot of different kinds of sexual expression, and they even had gods and goddesses who represented those kinds of sexual expression, but it wasn't necessarily a permissive culture, especially in terms of marriage or the behavior of women who were married. So if you were caught, for instance, having extramarital sex, that was punishable by death. So sex was an important part of their culture and of their rituals, but they were still weirdly kind of prudish when it came to the home life and when it came to marriage and sex within marriage. So now we're going to shift back east and talk about ancient Hebrew and Christian culture. So this becomes important later on in terms of America, but for now we're talking about probably about 3,000 years ago, and we'll start with the ancient Hebrews. So basically they were a nomadic people, and they were very concerned by the fact that they were new and their religion was new, and there simply weren't a lot of them. So most of their focus on sexuality was focused on procreation. They were pretty obsessed with heterosexual marriage, heterosexual sex, and making more babies. So there was some language about people you shouldn't sleep with in the Torah. For instance, there was language about pedophilia. You shouldn't sleep with a little boy as you would sleep with a man. But for the most part, they weren't super concerned with homosexuality or what people were doing in Sodom and Gomorrah. They were more concerned with getting everybody married off and making as many babies as possible. So there was a lot of focus on not having sex outside the marriage or not wasting your seed via masturbation, but mostly that's because they needed you to make more babies. Which leads us to early Christianity. So early Christianity was one of the first times that we start to see guilt introduced to sex. So in a lot of these other cultures, it was okay to enjoy sex once you were married, but in Christianity it begins to get a little bit foggy. There's a lot of language about sex being bad and purity being valuable. Mary was written as a virgin instead of a young girl, which was a whole thing and created a lot of interesting issues. But basically, within early Christianity, there was still the focus on procreation. So everybody needed to be heterosexual, they needed to get married, and they needed to have babies. So we no longer see sex as part of rituals. We no longer see sex as part of celebrations. It's meant to be like a purely monogamous activity so that you make even more babies. And this meant there was a lot of focus on purity, on virginity, on keeping people separate. So we really start to see the introduction of guilt and shame and modesty. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some African tribes. And one thing that I want to be clear about is that there are a lot of them, and they're all different. Sometimes in America we have an unfortunate tendency to sort of act like everything that happens in Africa is the same, even though it's a giant continent. So there's a huge amount of variation, and I just want to be clear about that for a second. But I wanted to talk about some of the things that they do that are super interesting. So for instance, very often African tribes are matrilineal, and what that means is that the bloodline follows the mother. And this is pretty common because basically we know who the mother was. But one thing that's interesting about matrilineal bloodlines is that it means that there's a lot more freedom for the woman. Because when you're following a patrilineal bloodline, it's important to know who the father was. But if you don't care who the father was, then the woman has a lot more sexual freedom. So often we see that in African tribes, the women have a lot of choice about who they sleep with, who they marry, who they have babies with, and that's something that we don't always see in other cultures, which is pretty cool. We also see a lot of bodily modifications. So very often puberty rituals are an important part of the sexual sort of experience. And so very often in African tribes, when a member of the tribe reaches puberty, depending on their gender, they'll go through different kind of rituals. And it might include bodily scarification, it might include going out into the woods, it might include vision quests. There's all sorts of options. But sometimes the bodily modification is meant to enhance your beauty, and sometimes it's meant to tell a story. So different tribes do it differently, but if you ever want to fall into a super interesting Wikipedia hole, this is a great place to start. I also wanted to tell you about how very often they tend to see marriage as a financial issue if there is a culture that practices marriage. So in cultures that do practice marriage, it does tend to be a sort of a trade. You might have a sort of dowry for the female member of the marriage, and her family would give the male member something of value, land, animals, food. So sometimes it does tend to be a little bit of a financial exchange in the cultures that are concerned about monogamy. One really interesting example of an African tribe and what they do in regard to sexuality is the Wadabi tribe. So basically, they are more concerned with male beauty than female beauty at least once a year. So once a year, they have this great big festival, and the men spend all day getting dressed up, and they use a lot of different kinds of makeup to enhance their beauty. So like small noses, straight noses are considered valuable, and white teeth are considered valuable. So the makeup is very strategic to sort of emphasize their good features. And then they dance. And they dance and dance and dance. And the women are sort of around the outside of the circle, and they pick their favorite male dancer and tap him, and then discreetly leave to go have sex later. And you don't have to choose your own husband or anyone you know. You literally just choose the man that you thought was the prettiest. So this is kind of an interesting example of the ways that we think about beauty and choice differently in different cultures. Another interesting example is the Creole People in Cambodia. So I just wanted to tell you about them briefly because they do something that might be a good idea for a lot of other cultures, which is that they empower their young women. So when a young woman comes of age, her family builds her a little hut that's kind of called a love hut, and this is where she can entertain male suitors. So it's separate from the rest of the family, and she chooses who comes in, who goes out, who stays the night, and in this way there's a lot of female empowerment, especially for young women. And one interesting side effect of this is that they experience very little sexual violence. Men believe that women have the right and the ability to choose their own sex partners, so you don't see a lot of sexual violence against women. Instead, there tends to be a sort of respect of what their choices might be and what they might want out of a partner. So this is another interesting example of the ways that if we think about sex differently, we might experience different kinds of outcomes. Next, I thought we might look at some artistic examples of ways that different cultures show the human body in terms of art. So one thing that's really interesting about this is that different cultures value different things. Sometimes we like it when people are really skinny, sometimes we like it when people are muscular, sometimes we like it when they're chubby. It has a lot to do with what that culture values and what's going on with that culture when that specific piece of art is created. So let's start with some appreciation of the male form. So this first statue here on the left is from Central Africa, and it's several hundred years old, although the exact date is unknown. And he's especially interesting because you'll notice that his proportions are a little bit different. He has a long neck, which does tend to be valuable in certain African cultures. And you'll also notice that his penis is pretty large and it hangs down. So this is different from Michelangelo's David that we see here in the middle. When Michelangelo was working, it was considered kind of tacky for a man to have a large penis. So David has a small, polite penis fitting of a polite man in that culture. On the right, we see a painting from the Renaissance, and you'll notice that not only has the art form become a lot more detailed, there's a lot of focus on musculature. So this was when humans were really starting to experiment with light in terms of oil painting. So you can see that there's a lot of detail, a lot of valleys, and a lot of focus on what the human body might look like if you examined it very, very closely. Next, let's look at some examples of the female form. So here we see a lot of different variations on what we think the female body should look like. Let's start all the way to the right. That is the Venus of Willendorf. And she's probably about 30,000 years old. And she's very small, which is kind of interesting. She's only about 4 inches tall. But she's thought to be a fertility symbol. And you'll notice, for instance, that her breasts are abnormally large, so is her butt, so is her tummy. And it's thought that she was designed this way to sort of show the ideal female form in terms of fertility and the producing of babies. In the middle, we see a statue of Athena, I think, possibly Aphrodite. But this one is Greek. And you'll notice that she's very muscled and that there is a focus on the female form, but she is also covering herself up in terms of a little tiny bit of modesty. Finally, on the left, you'll see that we're edging back towards a little bit of chubbiness now. And this painting has lots and lots of layers in terms of what's important, but the primary focus, of course, is the reclining nude figure in the front. There's a lot of symbols of her wealth, including her little dog and her servants who are behind her. And she's meant to sort of show the female in repose, but also the way that wealth can make a person very calm and perhaps even a little bit chubby. Another thing I want to point out about these various different types of art is that very often artists would make art of naked humans when they didn't necessarily mean to be naked. So we see this all the time in terms of like religious paintings or paintings of ancient myths. Very often the subject of the painting doesn't need to be nude, but it was a great excuse to draw naked people, and that's classic human. One thing that you may have noticed in this brief overview of different cultures is that some cultures are super concerned with monogamy and some cultures aren't. So part of this has to do with female virginity. Basically, we're very concerned with paternity. We want to know who the father is. And if you want to know who the father is, typically you need to restrict access to the female. So sometimes this manifests as an obsession with female purity. Male purity, not as much of a concern, as you may have noticed. Female purity, on the other hand, is a recurring theme. So very often we'll see women represented in art with things like unicorns, which were considered to be really pure, or they'll be wearing a color that represents purity in their culture, often white or another light color. But typically what we see is that the female is represented as pure as possible. Light shining down upon her, pure water somewhere behind her. This becomes a really important theme in art and in culture as we go. So as I said previously, this has a lot to do with paternity. So basically, paternity is when you are following the male bloodline, as we said earlier. So that means you want to know who the father is, and then you can know who their children are. Often this gets even more focused with what we call primogeniture, which is when wealth or established importance or positions in the community travel from the father to the first son, to his first son, to his first son, to his first, etc., etc. So sometimes you might see like kingships pass this way, sometimes wealth passes this way, but basically cultures that are focused on paternity do tend to have a corresponding focus on virginity, because it's very important to know who the father is. One notable exception to this is Tibetan polyandry. So we talked a little bit about polygamy, which is when one man has multiple wives, but polyandry is when one wife has multiple husbands. And this is actually pretty rare. We almost never see this. The only time we do typically see this is when land or wealth is at a shortage. So this does tend to happen in Tibet because they're rapidly running out of land because they're literally on a mountain. So sometimes in Tibet, one woman will marry multiple brothers. And what that means is that they don't have to divide up the family wealth or the family land or the family resources, because basically every child that woman has is essentially part of the same family. So it doesn't really matter who the father is because they're all sort of contained in the next generation. It's super interesting, but we don't see it in very many places. So now let's talk about America. So once again, I'm going to go pretty fast and sort of glaze over a bunch of things, but the important information should be here. So let's start with the people who were already in America. So much like the different African tribal cultures, there were a lot of different kinds of Native American tribal cultures. But there were a few things that they tended to hold in common, so I thought I might mention them. One is that there wasn't a lot of focus on paternity. Once again, they typically were matrilineal cultures, and so there wasn't necessarily a lot of focus on monogamy either. In some Native American tribes, they didn't really understand paternity in terms of sperm, so it was thought that a woman could sleep with a man in her tribe who had the best qualities, and from them sort of make one baby. So you would sleep with the guy who was like the fastest runner or the best hunter or the cutest or whatever, and it was thought that you would essentially fill up your womb with sperm until you had enough, and then a baby would come out, and he would be a mixture of all of the men that you had slept with, which is a great way of thinking about it, and of course, we didn't know better for many hundreds of years. So a lot of Native American tribal cultures were also on the move all the time. So this has a lot to do with our sort of views about monogamy. If you don't have like a place where you live with your partner, sometimes you become less concerned about who your partner is over the course of your lifetime. So again, there was a huge amount of variation, and it is also an excellent Wikipedia hole to fall down, but a lot of Native American tribes were pretty relaxed about sex, they were pretty relaxed about gender, and they did sometimes make room for non-heterosexual relationships as well. So this was a pretty peaceful in a lot of ways in terms of sexuality, until the white people got here. So the first white colonists to really settle here were the Puritans, who were of course very puritanical. So they were not very into sex except for in the marriage, and it should be for procreation only. It was okay if you enjoyed it, but that wasn't the goal. The goal should be procreation, and if you had sex outside of marriage, either before you were married or an extramarital affair, you would be put in the stocks, men and women both, and people could throw things at you. So the original white colonists were not very sexually permissive, shall we say. Next, we had the sort of Protestant Reformation in America, and one of the things that was interesting about this in regard to sex was the obsession with witchcraft. Very often, witches and sexuality are sort of associated with one another. Witches are thought to be super sexual, or they're thought to be dangerous in regard to sexuality, like they'll come steal your man. There is some thought that we might think of witches and sexuality together because they were using brooms as sort of like dildos, possibly even with potions, which would be like lube on top. But we're not totally sure why it is that witches ride brooms. That might be why. So during the Protestant Reformation, there was a little bit of talk about sex, but it was only in regard to sex being bad and evil and the kind of thing that bad women do. This didn't stop men from going to brothels, but it was important anyway. As America progressed on into the Victorian age, we actually got weirder about sex, which is so American. But basically, we started this obsession with sexuality where it was hugely repressed, and that meant it was the only thing on anybody's mind. Every time you try to tell people not to think about sex, the opposite occurs: humans. So basically, during the Victorian era, propriety was very important. Everyone should be behaving properly at all times, everyone should be dressed properly at all times, male and female communication, also very proper. And one of the things that this meant was that people were obsessed with tiny little slip-ups. So you'll notice in this picture, for instance, that you can see this woman's ankles, which means she's a major whore. But it was also kind of an interesting time because people were trying so hard not to talk or think about sex that they started experimenting with it in very strange ways. So we start to see the sort of introduction of the medicalization of sex. So this is when we start to see vibrators being invented and used exclusively by male doctors on female patients to cure hysteria, which we'll talk about that more later. But basically, during the Victorian age, everyone was trying so hard to be proper that there was a natural sort of explosion behind the scenes of interest in sexuality. So we saw a huge rise in homosexual behavior, underground clubs, and of course, women talking about it quietly. It's important to note that the whole time all of these changes were happening in white culture, our treatment of non-white people was terrible across the board. Basically, we dehumanized anybody that we didn't see as fitting into our American ideals, which included whiteness, Christianity, basically anybody who was an immigrant from the right parts of Europe. So during this whole period of time, we actually tended to over-sexualize anybody who wasn't white. So if you think about the slave auctions, that was definitely a sexualized experience for a lot of the people who were enslaved and being sold, especially the women. The way that we treated the Native Americans was outright terrible at every single level, but again, it was often considered that they were not quite human, so it was acceptable to rape them. So our treatment of non-white people this whole time had very little to do with our sexual mores for each other. It was much more about how we felt those other people weren't quite human. So this is not a proud time of American history, but it is one that we need to directly address. So as we get into the 19th century, we start to see, first, a rise in sexual permissiveness, a rise in free love. People started building utopian communities. It was a huge thing. The hippies didn't invent that. But with every rise in sexual permissiveness comes a corresponding dip in sexual permissiveness. Basically, every time we start to get too wild and free, another part of the population comes along and clamps things down. So at the beginning of this century, we saw some thought about free love. At the end of the century, we started to get a little more repressed. So in 1873, we had the establishment of the Comstock Laws. And basically, they meant that you couldn't mail anything through the U.S. Postal Service that might be considered pornographic or scandalous. This is Comstock himself here. Basically, he was concerned that people would be mailing pornographic pamphlets using the U.S. Postal Service, and that it would lead directly to the degradation of society. So he made it illegal, and what that meant was that the post office collected any packages that they thought might be pornographic in nature and kept them safe in their own little collection. Guess who guarded that collection? Yep, it was Comstock. You can see where I'm going with this. But this was kind of an interesting moment in time, because to collect pornographic materials through the mail meant that there were pornographic materials in the mail. So clearly Americans were interested in starting to enjoy this new variety of pornography, even though other Americans were interested in stopping them from doing that. We also had a couple other interesting things happen in the 19th century. So the rise of polygamy and Mormon religion was pretty important to American culture, but this is when the Mormons started being forced west, and a lot of them went to Utah or went to Mexico because America outlawed polygamous marriage. We also started to see the medicalization of sex. And what that means is that it started to be part of our greater medical understanding. And in large part what that meant was that white men assumed that they knew everything and took over everything. So this was when men started to get involved in childbirth, for instance. Previously that had been an exclusively female domain, and then men started to medicalize that procedure. This is when we started to see people inventing vibrators, some of which were steam-powered, and those were largely used by male doctors on female patients who were experiencing hysteria. We'll get more to that later. But basically, we started medicalizing almost everything about the human body, and sex was another major part of that. In the 20th century, we started to see another rise in permissive sexuality, followed by another fall in terms of repressive sexuality. So first, we started with the flappers. So this was a really interesting generation of women because they were really empowered. They started leaving the house, they started smoking cigarettes, going to jazz clubs, and they started wearing dresses that ended above the knee. What a bunch of whores. But still, it was unusual because we had just graduated from this era where the female body needed to be as covered up as possible, and one of the ways that these women were rebelling was by being not as covered up and having a more open expression of their sexuality. But this was followed immediately by the Great Depression, so everything kind of calmed back down, the clubs shut, everybody went back into a more family-based, sort of careful expression of sexuality, which was followed at the end of World War II by the baby boom. The economy was doing great, so everybody got married and got a house and had 2.5 children. This was itself followed by the hippie movement. So in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a rejection of what their parents had done. Again, you're going to see this cycle happen over and over. So the hippies brought back this concept of free love. They brought back non-monogamy. They brought back the concept of utopias. But this time, there was something new, and that was the pill. So the invention of birth control changed everything in terms of how we thought about sex, how we thought about marriage, how we thought about childbirth and family planning. So the invention of the pill was a vital, vital, vital thing in terms of sexuality in America. And I should also mention that right before we invented the pill, we invented penicillin. And penicillin was also a game changer because it meant that we could quickly take care of sexually transmitted infections. And this was a real problem, especially after World War II, because soldiers and prostitutes tend to travel together. So a lot of people came home with sexually transmitted infections, and we needed a way to nip that in the bud. So over the course of the 20th century, we had one more upheaval and repression. I also wanted to introduce a few key things that happened at the end of the 20th century that we will keep talking about in course as the semester goes on. So the first is in 1973, the Supreme Court case Roe versus Wade. So this was the case that legalized abortion in America. Prior to this, abortion had been illegal, which made it really dangerous, and a lot of people died. So the point of this case was to make it legal so that it could be more safe and more accessible. This is something we've been arguing about ever since. Another key thing in 1973 was that the American Psychological Association decided to take homosexuality out of the DSM. So the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and it's sort of the guidebook for humans and human behavior. And so the American Psychological Association meets every year, and part of what they do is decide what goes in the DSM and what might come out. So in 1973, they decided that homosexuality was not a disease, it was not a problem, it was just a thing that humans could be. So taking it out made it not a disorder, and that was really important for the legal and social consideration of homosexuality in America. Another thing was in 1979, we changed the definition of rape to include rape in marriage. So prior to 1979, it was totally legal to rape your own wife because the wife was thought of as property of the husband. So seriously, it wasn't until 1979 where we made that also a crime. Also, in 1983, we finally figured out what AIDS was. Prior to 1983, we weren't really sure what this new disease was or how it spread. Very often it was called a gay disease. Sometimes people called it GRID. But when we changed it to AIDS, one of the things that was very important was that it no longer had any association with a particular gender or sexuality. That was really important in terms of making it not quite so scary, not quite such a damning thing to have, but it took a really long time to get the medical industry interested in AIDS and to get the legalization of certain procedures on the books so that it wasn't such a terrible, terrible thing that killed a whole community. In the 21st century, we've already done all sorts of things, even though we're only a couple decades in. So one of the things that was really important historically was that in 2015, we legalized gay marriage. This was honored by the White House turning rainbow, which is always a great picture. But again, this was important because we were one of the first nations to legally establish that this was an okay thing to do. It is still a problem in different states, but we're working on it. We're also, as a country, starting to deal with whether birth control should be covered by the Affordable Care Act, and therefore covered at least in part by other people's tax dollars. This, of course, would be cheaper and more efficient, but it does mean that a lot of people feel like they're paying for women to have sex, so you can imagine how mad people still are. There's a couple more issues that we're still sort of dealing with that I'd like to talk about. In the current day, we have a lot of overlap of the personal and the political, sort of like we talked about in terms of the second wave of feminism. And what this means is that we're legislating a lot of things that are often quite personal in nature. So for instance, we're working on things like dating culture. Should we control the apps? Who has those? Should we date during a pandemic, or should we make it illegal? What about male birth control? Should we put some responsibility on the shoulders of men and take some off the shoulders of women? What about things like mutating STIs? Part of the reliance on antibiotics that our modern culture has means that the STIs that are out there tend to mutate really quickly, and they become things like super syphilis, which is pretty dangerous. We're also talking about things like the frequency of sexual assault. In civilizations past, and really even in decades past in America, we just didn't talk about it too much. But these days, we're starting to talk about what kind of behaviors might lead to sexual assault, and how, as a society, we can begin to stop that. So part of the things that I want to talk about over the course of this class are the ways that sometimes this is legal, and sometimes this is social, and sometimes those two things overlap. So for instance, we have a lot of ongoing court cases about things like abortion, about sexual discrimination in the workplace, about sexual harassment in the workplace, about who can sue who in terms of sexual assault. And we're also dealing with a lot of complicated social issues. Things like, how do we hold people accountable for things that they might have said that aren't illegal but are questionable? Or What do we do about surgeries that people can have now in terms of gender confirmation? And of course, even more concerned about birth control. We are always concerned about birth control. So, I hope that helped to give you sort of a brief overview of what different cultures do and different things we've thought over the course of history. I just wanted to make the point that everybody thinks about sex differently, and however you think about sex is probably determined by where and when you are, even though that can be a hard thing for us to recognize. So, if you have any questions, send me an email, and I'll see you next time.